Well, greetings. Here we are in session number 8, and we're going to be talking about Paul's second missionary journey today. Last week, we talked primarily about Paul and his relationship with the Christians in Jerusalem. And especially, we talked about his relationship with the leaders in that Jerusalem church, James, Peter, and John. Now, that ends with an agreement, and also we saw a reconciliation between Paul and Peter, and also between Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. Those issues that they had to do with Jewish identity, with tradition, and with that law that gave protection to the Jews from Roman oppression. Now today we follow Paul on the second journey, and we're going to try to get him to Corinth today. Paul moves westward on this journey, and he does not take Barnabas with him, but we meet a new group of team members. So we meet Silas and Timothy and Luke. Second journey is also much longer in distance than the first journey. Paul does not stay close to home this time. And so we are introduced to a number of new places, places that are far from Jerusalem and far from the issues that we found the Jerusalem church dealing with. Paul encounters instead a very different set of issues. Things like pagan traditions, how the church interacts with them, a very different perspective on Rome and the Roman authorities, and the philosophies that are well established in people's minds. So, Paul and Silas leave Antioch. They're not quite sure where they're going to go. They visit a few of the churches from their first trip. They go back to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. And then they just wander for a while, and they wander all the way to Troas before the Spirit directs them through a vision into the great cities of Europe in that day. Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth, and then they head back to Antioch, but they go first to Ephesus in Asia. So today we want to look at some of those cities and see if we can follow Paul's travels all the way to Corinth. The next 3 weeks, Kent and Ronna Egging then will be leading you through a reading of those letters of Paul to the church at Corinth. So we better get started on this journey. Got a long way to go from Antioch to Corinth, especially going overland through Troas. Let's turn to Acts chapter 16. That's where we find the story as Paul and Silas start a 2-year journey. This is now 49 through 51 AD. Journey starts out simply enough. They go to places they've been before. They explain the agreement that the Jerusalem council made with them. And they meet Timothy at Lystra. And Timothy is a disciple who comes highly recommended by that local church. And so we see Paul is doing what he does. He builds teams and he works in teams. Now we notice a difference as they go through these towns. Nobody tries to stone Paul this time. And it seems, at least for a time, that the opposition has gone away. The churches seem to be doing well. Verse 5, so the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Timothy is circumcised, and that's going to help as they go to synagogues along the way. But remember, there's a real difference between what's going on in Jerusalem and what goes on in some of these distant cities. Maybe that wouldn't be as necessary in the cities that lie ahead. Paul and Silas are still thinking primarily of the issues that they found in Jerusalem. They are moving west, but they seem to be facing east. And so they come to this time of wandering. Their wandering is not what we would say wandering away from the faith. That's not it at all. And it's not wandering in the wilderness like Israel did for 40 years. This is different. This is a purposeful time of inactivity which God was using in their lives to prepare them for what lie ahead. Now, think about that a bit. Have you had a time like that in your life? In my years as a pastor, I always moved from one place to another place without any significant break or interruption in the ministry. We were in Jamestown, New York for 3 years. We traveled quickly across the country and started right up in Mount Vernon. When we left Mount Vernon, we drove straight to Illinois, began right away in Libertyville for the next 11 years. There was no break, there was no time of inactivity in all of that. However, I have known a number of pastors who have had significant times between calls. And for a whole variety of reasons, they have had times of inactivity or times when they've done something else before going back into church ministry. And after a few years or a time, then they returned to being a pastor in a church. Now, what I've observed in their ministry is that their ministry has been very strong and effective after a time of inactivity, after we would say a time of wandering. So God uses our wandering times. God uses the times in our lives when we are not clear about what we're supposed to be doing, when we're not sure if we're really making progress. And God uses those times to prepare us for what is coming next. That's the case with Paul, Silas, and Timothy. They wander across Asia. They don't stop in any towns. They keep walking all the way to Troas. That's 300 miles of walking, by the way. And when they arrive, N.T. Wright says they are weary, puzzled, and disheartened. That's true. But they're also facing now in a new direction. They're no longer looking east, but they're facing the reality of the situations in the cities that lie ahead for them. The first city that they come to is Philippi. Philippi was founded by Philip II, the king of Macedonia. He was the father of Alexander the Great. Philippi was quite an interesting place. There were gold mines there. It was located on a major trade road between Rome and Byzantium, Istanbul, today. And Philippi became a colony for retired Roman soldiers. We talked about that group a little last week. There wasn't a synagogue there, not enough Jewish people for a synagogue. In fact, the locals did not like Jewish people. You see, Philippi doesn't sound like Jerusalem at all, does it? In Philippi, they meet three people. Three people we're told about. The first is a woman named Lydia. Lydia was an independent businesswoman. And so we see at that time and at that place, it was very possible for women to have quite a high standing, to be independent, to be free, to be involved in business. Quite different from other times and places that we read about in the Bible. Second person we run into is much younger, a fortune-telling slave girl, a girl with an evil spirit. She's in a very different situation than Lydia was. She's not free or independent at all. And then the third person we meet is a jailer who almost commits suicide. So quite a crew we run into here. Well, Paul, Silas, and Timothy get thrown into jail for being Jews. And the charge against them is they were teaching customs that are illegal for Romans to accept. Notice here the issue is what Romans can hear about, not Jews, as it was in Jerusalem. Maybe the accusation was that people were encouraged to abandon the imperial cult. You know, Christian faith, when it comes into an area brand new through a missionary kind of a project, Christian faith in those places always replaces something that's already established. Christianity doesn't come to people with a blank slate. People maybe who are wondering if there is a God, and they'd be interested to hear about that. No, Christianity always comes into places where people have opinions already, people have convictions already, people have religion already. Thank you very much. And so that's where they get into trouble, because they bring in something that's different from the convictions and the religion and the feeling about Rome, the imperial cult that people in Philippi already had. This is not Jerusalem. What's the main issue? The main issue really that they are encountering here is the meaning of salvation. You see, the Romans used that word salvation quite a bit. That wasn't a new word for them. To the Romans, salvation meant peace. The peace of Rome, the Pax Romana, that was salvation. The philosophers of the time that would have been in that area, they also used the word salvation. For them, salvation was escape from the world. And as we read the Bible, we find that there are levels of meaning in the Bible when that word salvation or the word save is used. The Greek word is sozo, and it means save or heal. It can mean either one. It can mean a whole range of things. When you get out of trouble, you've been saved from your trouble. Get out of jail, you've been saved from your jail. When you're healed, physically healed, that same word, sozo, save, heal, can be used. When you find new life in Christ, forgiveness of sins, the word save, salvation can be used. When you think about and come into an understanding of the hope for the world, salvation is the word that's used. So, used in a lot of different ways. Now let's think about these people we've just met. Chapter 16 in Acts. For Lydia, what did salvation mean? Lydia was doing fine. She was financially well off. She was independent. She had her own business. She was going for prayer at the place where the Jews met. I don't think she had any huge needs or oppression or things that were wrong, we would say, in her life. And there, in the hearing of the gospel, Lydia was saved. She came to salvation. She met Christ. She received the gospel. Salvation for Lydia. Well, how about the slave girl? Well, the slave girl, very different. She was oppressed by an evil spirit. She was owned by masters who no doubt were cruel to her. She lived a miserable life. And Paul cast the demon out of her, and so she was no longer of any use to these masters that she had. She was saved from oppression. I don't know, it doesn't say if she came to accept Christ in her life, come to believe in Christ, but she came to a kind of a physical, mental, and somewhat spiritual salvation. Quite different, isn't it, the way that word could be used? Well, how about for the jailer? The jailer, the earthquake comes, they're set free, afraid he's lost his prisoners. That means he's in trouble, big trouble. He could lose his life. And so he's about to commit suicide. That's about as deep a problem as you can have. And Paul saves him from losing his life. And he proclaims the gospel. And so the jailer and his family are baptized. Salvation. Lots about salvation in chapter 16. The first place that they really go that's new, Philippi. Quite powerful. They leave Philippi and they go on to Thessalonica, and that would be chapter 17 in Acts, if you want to kind of follow along here. Thessalonica, it's a prosperous city, a port city. And it does have a synagogue. There are Jewish people there. Those who hear the gospel from Paul and accept the gospel, accept Christ into their lives, we find out includes some Jewish people. And then Luke tells us it's a large number of God-fearing Greeks. And then he says quite a few prominent women. Very interesting. So, again, this gives us some understanding of the place of women in society at that time and in those prominent Roman cities. The place of women seems to kind of go up and down in the Bible as you read different parts, different places, locations. It's different depending on time and place. But here, there are prominent, independent, strong women who apparently have businesses and have a place in society, looked up to, have a voice. Why was it then, what was it that drew these women to the gospel at that time when life was really going pretty well for them? Paul, first of all, we want to note, is clearly not perceived as being anti-women at that time. That's a bad word that you hear these days about Paul, that he was anti-women. It's simply not true. And as Paul comes in and proclaims the gospel, there is no hint that he is anti-women. In fact, the prominent women are drawn to the gospel and the preaching of Paul. Wouldn't it be great if we could have had some kind of an interview with some of these prominent women? We would love to know more about them and understand how it was they came to be drawn to the gospel and found Jesus in their lives. Just would be great to know more. But Luke doesn't tell us. Now, in Thessalonica, there's opposition. And it comes kind of quickly. Opposition from some Jews who Luke says were jealous. Interesting word. They were jealous. What does that mean? And they go to the marketplace and round up some bad characters, Luke says. Presumably, we're talking about Gentiles, just the gang members that hang around the marketplace, bad characters that some of these Jewish people go and round them up and say, we got something for you to do. Now, why do some of these Jewish people oppose Paul? What do they have against Paul coming in and proclaiming Christ? Well, there's a commentator, I'm not familiar with this commentator, but his name's Gerd Thiessen. Gerd Thiessen. He was quoted in one of the books I was reading. This is what he writes. The Christian mission was luring away the very Gentiles who were Judaism's patrons. The Jews, as a minority, had come to depend on the recognition and advocacy of such people in a foreign Gentile world full of anti-Jewish prejudices. So you've got this minority community of Jewish people. They live among Gentiles. Most of the Gentiles don't like them. But there are some God-fearing Gentiles, and there are some prominent people who are Gentiles who stand up for the Jews, who protect them. Now, as these people are being drawn to Christ, the Jews begin to feel uneasy. Their supporters seem to be being drawn away. Maybe that's why they're not happy to have Paul with them. Notice here in chapter 17 that the charge against Paul has to do with defying Caesar's decrees, saying there's another king. Notice again, the charge is not about some Jewish law they're breaking. It's a Roman law or tradition, saying there's a king other than Caesar. Let's look at verse 7 here in chapter 17. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there's another king, one called Jesus. So that's the charge they bring against them. In a city like Thessalonica, a charge of breaking Jewish law or tradition would not go very far. Nobody cared about that. If you broke kosher, you were not going to get into trouble in Thessalonica. They have to answer the accusation of breaking a Roman law. So, now Paul has proclaimed the gospel. Some have believed, received Christ, and they begin a church. There's now a church in Thessalonica, and it's made up of some traditional Jewish people and some Greeks and some prominent women. And they are vulnerable. This is a vulnerable church right away because the Jewish community now is suspicious of them and can bring some attacks against them. And the Romans are also suspicious of them because they're bringing in ideas that don't fit well with the imperial cult. And so this new church, mixture of Jewish and Gentile, they are probably not extended the legal protection that Jewish communities had from the Romans. They're vulnerable. And you read Thessalonians, you'll pick it up right away. They hit some persecution, some trouble. So, Paul and his team leave Thessalonica and they travel south. They get off the main road now. They get off that main east-west road that would have taken them to Rome. For some reason, they go south instead. They head, rather than heading to Rome, they head to Athens. Maybe that's a change of plans. Maybe that's a little safer for them to go south to Athens rather than trying to continue on to Rome. The first town that they hit is the city of Berea. And there's a synagogue in Berea, a very good one, because we learn that this synagogue has some very serious Bible students in it. These are people who check the scriptures to see if it's true about any teaching that comes their way. Unfortunately, there's a mob from Thessalonica that follows them to Berea. And the mob seems to be focused on Paul. So Paul has to leave. And he goes on, travels by himself to Athens. Silas and Timothy stay in Berea. Now, that's very interesting, isn't it? That they're allowed to stay and apparently continue to spread the gospel and talk to people and aren't persecuted. Something about this mob. They just wanted Paul. So Paul leaves, gets on a boat, goes to Athens all alone. So Paul's having a rough time. He gets chased out of Philippi, he gets chased out of Thessalonica, and he gets chased out of Berea. Remember this vision that he had when they were in Troas, and the man from Macedonia says, "Come over, need to hear from you." My, I don't think Paul was expecting that kind of a reception. Get chased out, thrown in jail, mobs after you everywhere you go. Now, one other thing we should mention, when you read the letters to Philippi, and we're going to do that in the spring, and if you read Thessalonians, it's clear that Paul established in those places very strong relationships with the people there, with the people in the churches there. They love Paul. And these are some of his best churches. Philippi, Thessalonica. He talks very highly of those churches. And so Luke may have compressed the time that he actually was able to stay in those places. He made strong relationships, both those places. Okay, let's go on. Chapter 17. Acts 17, on to Athens. Let's read a little bit of that. Pick up in verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange idea to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Then Paul stands up and gives quite a speech in the Areopagus. You'll want to read that. Now, today, if you took a trip to Athens, wonderful place, you would really be impressed and taken by the beauty of these ancient buildings, the Parthenon, and there's a whole variety of them. They're magnificent. And you would just be amazed at the sculpture that you see there, and go to the museums and see all these figurines. It's wonderful. But for Paul, it wasn't wonderful. Paul was alone in Athens. He wasn't a tourist, and he wasn't there to see the grand architecture and the sculpture. Paul felt neck deep in idols, and he was deeply troubled by that. And so he doesn't wait for the rest of his team to get there. He can't stand it any longer. He goes to the synagogue and he starts preaching Christ to them. And we don't learn that anybody in the synagogue accepted his message. There's no sense that some accepted. Luke doesn't tell us that. And so he goes to the marketplace. The Agora, it's called. He goes to the marketplace, and what he finds is a whole bunch of philosophers standing around, because they don't do anything all day. They don't work. They just philosophize all the time. And so he talks to them. And they call him a babbler. Well, that's what the NIV, that's how it's translated, a babbler. It's not a compliment. See, F.F. Bruce says it's a term of disparaging Athenian slang. You don't want to be called that. A peddler of second-hand scraps of philosophy. In fact, the word sounds like sparrow. And literally it means a seed picker or a gutter sparrow. You know how you feel when you go to a big city and you're downtown and there's pigeons all over and they're looking for French fries and things that people have dropped on the street, and they're kind of picking at this and that. That's what they were calling Paul. Here's another philosopher who just comes and sort of picks at ideas here and there and spews them out like sparrows spitting seeds. That's not a compliment. They're not so happy. Well, anyway, they didn't understand what he was saying. He proclaimed to them, Luke says, the good news of Jesus and the resurrection. Now, the Greek word for resurrection is anastasis. And they thought, what they heard him say, what he was talking about, a couple of foreign gods. One of them was named Jesus, and his female consort was named Anastasis. A couple of foreign gods. That's who Paul's talking about. They were completely confused. They did not understand what he said. And what he said was threatening to them. So they brought him and put him on trial. The senior council of Athens was called the Areopagus. And N.T. Wright explains the Areopagus was a court of law. And it was made up of former rulers of Athens. This was not a philosophical society. This was not just any old place to go, talk about your ideas. This was a trial. This was a court. It was serious business to be brought before the Areopagus. Paul could have lost his life very easily. And the charge that they brought against Paul was that he was bringing novel theological ideas which were a threat to the society. Centuries before, that's exactly the charge that was brought against Socrates. He ends up committing suicide, Well, still going at it. It's the same thing. And so Paul defends himself with this speech that he makes in his trial. And he says he is not introducing foreign gods. He is proclaiming the one true God who has unveiled his purpose for the world in the resurrection of Jesus. He probably said more than Luke records. Luke probably took notes, But the important thing is after he gives his speech there, he's acquitted. They don't throw him in jail. They don't execute him. This court of senior judges that doesn't find anything wrong with what Paul is proclaiming. He's acquitted in court. But he wasn't understood either. Acquitted, but not really understood. And so he really doesn't find any followers. And we don't find a church there, do we? I mean, he doesn't write a letter to the Athenians later on. So he leaves. He moves on. Where does he go? Goes up the road to Corinth. Aha, we made it. For the next 3 weeks, Kent and Rhonda Egging are going to tell us about Corinth. And then they're going to guide us through kind of a quick reading of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So we look forward to that. And tune in next week. And we'll keep going with Paul in Corinth, reading Corinthians together. Look forward to it. Bye for now.